Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Humanities Center's series called All Change Here, Transformation and Pandemics and Transformation. This is the fourth in our series, and our final speakers will present next Wednesday. So I'll remind you of that at the end of our program today. Today we have a focus on transforming history, and we've invited Dr. Derrick Cartwright and Dr. Colin Fisher to speak to us today. So shall we begin with Derrick? Is that okay? All right, let me just introduce you for those of you who may not know him as well as we do. Derrick is a professor in USD's Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History. He first came to USD in 1993 with a PhD in art history from the University of Michigan. His office was next to mine in Founders. I had a spacious and accommodating office with two windows that looked out into Founders Courtyard. Derrick had a little tiny closet with no windows and barely enough room for him and a student. Derrick was enthusiastic, hardworking, and creative, and he did not stay in that tiny space very long. In '98, Derrick and his family moved to Giverny, France, where he became the director of the Musée d'Art Américain. And from there, his career as museum director led him to Dartmouth and the Hood Museum of Art, back to San Diego and the San Diego Museum of Art, to Seattle and the Seattle Art Museum, and finally, in 2012, back to our campus, where he is director of university galleries and professor of practice. He oversees 6 university galleries, and since his return, has expanded the university's well-known print collection by over 1,000 prints and initiated a relationship with the British Museum. Just so his job remains challenging, he also serves as the Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Timken Museum of Art and is currently a member of the Public Art Committee for the City of San Diego. Derrick, not surprisingly, has many areas of expertise, some of which are North American art and architecture, transatlantic cultural exchange, museum and curatorial practice, and the history of public art. He teaches here a variety of theoretical and practical courses, and he enjoys demystifying the art world for undergraduates. He teaches several courses dedicated to museums, the history of collecting, and the problems of curatorship. Dr. Cartwright will speak this afternoon on representations of plague in Renaissance painting from Colmar to Venice.
First, I'd like to thank Cynthia Kaywood and the Humanities Center team for this invitation to speak in this series. I've heard the other presentations, including Cynthia's own, and it's a real honor for me to be part of this dialogue. So I did have a few things I wanted to say before starting, and the first is to admit that I'm not a Renaissance art specialist. I seem to have trouble saying no. So forgive me for interloping in an area that my colleagues actually may know better than me. I am privileged to work in a couple of contexts where I come into contact with Renaissance art, great Renaissance art at the Timken, as Cynthia said, and also at USD with our own collection of prints. At the same time, I've also been thinking a lot about and writing a little bit about what it might mean to do a kind of public art history in an era of Zooms, Facebook Live, Instagram posts, and thinking this might be an opportunity to intervene meaningfully in that. I'm eager to do that. All this is just to say, I hope this talk leads to something beyond its narrow title and prompts a little bit of further discussion after Colin and I have finished. I'm going to read, even though we're a small group, I'm going to read this talk because I do better that way. And I hope you'll bear with me. COVID-19 is with us now, permeating most of our daily lives, including, I need not remind this group, academic life. Lately, I've been measuring it against the only other pandemic I've ever known, the AIDS crisis. While preparing for this talk, in addition to reviewing the text that other speakers have called out for study, Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, and Albert Camus' La Peste, I took time to reread Susan Sontag's work of fiction, The Way We Live Now. That text originally appeared in The New Yorker in November of 1986, and the experience of rereading it in 2020 brought me back to a moment in my own early adulthood when, like so many others living in San Francisco in the 1980s, I became accustomed to, unnervingly so, the daily dread of learning which artists, acquaintances, colleagues, and friends had recently become sick or died of disease. Picking up Sontag again, I'm less struck by her short stories' uncanny resemblance to any circumstance that perturbs us today, although that exists, than I am the unexpected overlap between her nuanced ideas about representation and some less subtle thoughts of my own that I'd planned to explore in this presentation. My point of departure in what amounts to a speedy survey of pictorial solutions to hard to depict historical conditions will be Sontag's text, and what can and cannot be made visible through representation is our shared concern. I'm going to go back, I'm sorry. For those unfamiliar with the narrative, the way we live now is set in mid-1980s Manhattan. Sontag invites us to eavesdrop on a group of urbane friends as they share the soul-numbing experience of caring for another friend who remains unnamed while he rapidly succumbs to AIDS. Their voices interrupt and merge with one another's as Sontag moves the reader idiosyncratically, unceremoniously, ineluctably towards this death. It's a tough text to summarize, partly because it's so tragic and because it's not an entirely successful work of art. Sontag's struggle to adequately represent the AIDS pandemic in the early phases of its epidemiology mirrors well, I think, discomforts within that period's creative communities, as I recall them, disarmed by and subsequently rearmed to tackle publicly those terrifying fatal diagnoses. Because Sontag was an uncommonly polyvalent intellectual, however, she turns to art history as a way of making sense of this unsettled moment. In one part of the narrative, and it's the one that I'm quoting here, her characters invoke the martyred image of Saint Sebastian, a reference I will return to soon, but since my plan is to move chronologically, I hope you'll bear with me while I go backwards and then come up to that. Pathologists and historians who study pandemics comprehend that definitionally they're not discrete events. It's estimated, for instance, that approximately 100 separate outbreaks of plague of varying spread decimated Europe between roughly 1350 and 1700. Indeed, in Venice alone, no fewer than 25 documented outbreaks of bubonic plague were recorded between 1347 and 1680, a recurrence rate that equates to about once every 13 years, which is just to say that plague was a fact of everyday life in modern Italy. In Tuscany, the experience of Black Death, immortalized in the Decameron, an illustration for which I'm showing you here, was only slightly less persistent than it was in the Veneto, but otherwise not so different. Its symptoms and sources were interpreted by artists in both places, and in contrast to medieval representations of plague, which tended either to reinforce imaginatively the protective intercession of the Virgin Mary, or else document the ravages upon civilian populations without expressly figuring the disease itself. Trecento Florentines were convinced that, quote, the deadly pestilence had been sent upon us mortals by God in his just wrath by way of retribution for our iniquities. And that's quoting Boccaccio directly. Accordingly, images of Christ delivering fierce judgments on humanity proliferated throughout Italian art of the 1350s, especially in Florence. And here I'm showing you a trio of images from the Strozzi Chapel within Santa Maria Novella that follows this formula. Nardo Cioni provided his patrons with a familiar enough choice: salvation for the worthy, or else eternal torture in hell. And here, I think it's clear that Nardo's primary literary source is Dantes Inferno. As Louise Marshall has argued, plague is situated in works like Nardo's within the ongoing discourse of God's dealing with his chosen people and through the threat of punishment and promise of deliverance contained in one image. And Nardo's brother, who's responsible for the altarpiece I'm showing you on the far right, tellingly gave his treatment of an enthroned Christ a still more menacing demeanor than his brother, one designed to strike fear into any who risked misunderstanding the source of or the fate awaiting diseased sinners. These scare tactics, while scarcely unique, were mutable. And to explain this, I want to return briefly to what Xavier was starting to say in the passage I showed you from Sontag's text. He brings up Saint Sebastian, who's a key figure in the changing cult of Renaissance plague representation. This is a quote. "All I remember is the body of a beautiful youth bound to a tree, pierced by arrows, of which he seems oblivious," Tanya interjected. "People forget that the story continues," Xavier continued, "that when the Christian women came to bury the martyr, they found him still alive and nursed him back to health. And he said, according to Stephen, 'I didn't know Saint Sebastian didn't die.' It's undeniable, isn't it?" said Kate on the phone to Stephen. "The fascination of the dying. It makes me ashamed. We're learning how to die," said Hilda. End quote. The quest for alternative representational strategies to cope with new, unfamiliar descriptions of illness and death is central, it seems to me, to Sontag's effort to characterize rampant fear and pathos. And unsurprisingly, that leads her directly back to Renaissance image making. Sebastian becomes something more than a queer icon, but rather as a symbol of what it might mean to transcend the pandemic-ravaged body. Take this altarpiece by Pietro Perugino in the center of the slide as an example of what I mean. Alongside it to the right, I'm showing the kind of 18th century colonial religious icon that Xavier delivers to his lover's hospital room, but this one is Ecuadorian, the one in the story is Guatemalan, so I'm sorry. For the Quattrocento artist, plague is barely traceable on the immaculate Phoebic body of the martyr. Finally, to suggest how the Renaissance cult of this saint rapidly evolved, on the far right, I'm showing you Benozzo Guzzoli's treatment of Saint Sebastian, a rendering which actively resists Trecento models of a vengeful god. Sebastian stands at the bottom of the fresco, protecting all of San Gimignano, just as the angels to his right and to his left protect him from arrows thrown by God by breaking them into two and scattering them to the sky above his shoulders. As the 15th century came to an end, diseased bodies share space unequally with depictions of plague's divine sources. Figures suffer, they seem hopeless, but they resist and they live another day. Thriving alongside this view was the counter tendency to attribute plague to another sign of impending dread, the apocalypse. The idea of wrathful God taking indirect vengeance upon a sinning population found clearest expression, I think, in Albrecht Dürer's famous woodcuts of the apocalypse. And the third image in that 15-work series is called Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. I'm showing it to you here. And from left to right, it shows you death, famine, war, and plague. Each of those horsemen is equipped with requisite symbols, and in the case of plague, an Eastern crown and archer's bow are crucial to his identification. It's worth noting, shortly before producing this print, Dürer visited Venice. In 1494, his experiences there marked subsequent practice to an exceptional degree, and scholars even speculate that among Dürer's reasons for going to Italy at this time and leaving his home in Nuremberg was plague in central Germany. We might suppose, too, that this time exposed the 23-year-old Dürer to a different and wider repertoire of pandemic-related iconographies, including that familiar image of an enraged God the Father shooting arrows of contagion at unfaithful bodies. In any event, Dürer's unprecedented vision of apocalypse was instantly admired and widely copied throughout European art. But perhaps the best known of all examples of pandemic art is the so-called Eisenheim altarpiece, which was commissioned shortly before 1500 by the Order of St. Anthony in Eisenheim near today's Colmar. It wasn't completed for another 12 years. Since the 11th century, the Order of St. Anthony had cultivated a reputation for its miraculous record of healing the sick. The production of this monumental altarpiece was intended to clinch the order's claim to supremacy amongst Renaissance plague stoppers. In this case, the main disease associated with the altarpiece was not bubonic plague, but a disease transmitted by fungus associated with poor grain storage called ergotism, then known also as St. Anthony's fire. And today, physicians recognize that the ergot fungus induced multiple plague-like symptoms, mostly ending in death. The Brotherhood cared for stricken who were in turn encouraged to pray before Matthias Grunewald's polyptych, then conveniently housed within the order's hospital. and doing so involved witnessing an elaborately choreographed presentation with opening and closing doors and a dramatic final reveal, which for anybody who chose to follow its temporal staging. During a period of anti-clerical turmoil after the French Revolution, Grunewald's altarpiece was disassembled, removed from the hospital, and partly destroyed, which means today we only glimpse some of its original theatricality. We do know that when it was closed, as it was much of the time, 16th century worshippers confronted the grim scene I'm showing you here of crucifixion. Christ's body discolored and covered with sores, displaying signs of rigor mortis, and flanked tellingly by representations of Saint Sebastian and the abbot of the order is the exterior's main focus. And then he's shown again in even worse shape being interred in the predella. I don't actually have time to unpack the debates, but trust me, they exist. There's been a voluminous clinical discussion about the symptoms that Grunewald is recording here. Forensic specialists who know way more than me assert that Christ's conditions don't actually depict ergotism or St. Anthony's fire. Instead, they've said that the symptoms more substantially represent syphilis. And I can't judge except to say it's possible that those debates missed the point. The altarpiece's main goal was to boost the spirits of those who believed that relics stewarded by the monks at Eisenheim produced miracles, a point that the altarpiece's interior resolves. On rare occasions when the altarpiece wings were thrown open, worshippers were entreated to consider a contrasting vision of redemption, both spiritual and physical. Christ's previously spoiled body is restored to a glowing, blonde, pox-free perfection. There's a third fully revealed stage to this polyptych that reflects the continued torments of St. Anthony, but I'm going to skip it because that subject actually is my last example from the 16th century. It happens here in San Diego that we have several plague-inspired works, and I'm showing you one of them. I've been writing about them for the Timken's Work of the Week program, and so this image, which is Savaldo's depiction of the torment of St. Anthony, who's also the saint that appeared in that innermost core of the Eisenheim altarpiece, was painted in Venice, but made virtually at the same moment as Grunewald's masterpiece. And it depicts the hermit saint bedeviled by pests, quite literally driven by plague to an act of prayer. Anthony's tormentors, it hardly needs to be said, are these spectacularly inventive hybrid creatures that emerge from a fiery landscape, let's just call it Oregon. They reveal the artist's likely exposure to the fantastic imagery of Schongauer, Bosch, and Bruegel, among others. And in Venice, where Savaldo spent most of his career, it was bubonic plague and ergotism combined that caused so much widespread pain and suffering. Venice was also the place that could boast some of the first efforts to address pandemics through social controls. As early as 1423, Venetians established separate islands to house infected individuals, and shortly after that, the town enforced spaces to isolate newcomers for 40 days, 40 giorni, the linguistic origin of our term quarantine. Seen in this context, Savaldo's devotional image represents a culture restless to imagine new spatial solutions to the problem of unseen but not unimaginable contagion. I've said that Venice was especially vulnerable to plague, compromised as it was by its insularity and dependence upon foreign trade. Successive waves of plague between 1570s and 1680s killed an estimated 130,000 Venetians, or fully a third of the region's total population. Artists were engaged in civic actions. And here I'm just showing you Canaletto's heroic depiction of Santa Maria della Salute, an elaborate example of a late Baroque church whose construction was intended as an offering to the Virgin Mary to protect Venice from further outbreaks. I want to end by returning to Sontag's text as a conclusion. The final lines of her short story, shown here atop its 1991 republication as a limited edition expensive text illustrated by the British painter Howard Hodgkin, suggest imperfect solutions that works of art can offer in response to the problem of life under pandemic. the crisis of showing someone still alive prompts Sontag's self-absorbed narrators to observe, in a painting or a photo, you can't show still. The Way We Live Now promotes the verbal narrative, not visual representations, as the most effective form of tribute. But the AIDS crisis endured and remains among us and has something to teach us. Words were only partially effective tools for many artists. While indignant voices urged communities to act up, other artists joined in activism to create elegiac images that count amongst the most poignant representations of our era. I'm just showing you Felix Gonzalez Torres' portrait of Ross, which I think counts in that category. In the end, these twin representational strains helped shape public opinion and spurred public health officials to redouble efforts to curtail the pandemic's spread. According to the United Nations, at least 33 million men, women, and children perished from AIDS-related causes across the globe since the 1980s, approximately 700,000 of them in this country. It's challenging to find reliable statistics from the 14th to 17th centuries, but estimates put the total number of victims of Black Death at 25 million in Europe alone. And as of this morning, 936,000 people have perished from COVID-19, 199,000 of them in the United States. That is the way we live now. Thanks.
Okay, well, let's continue our exploration of this topic with Colin Fisher, who is a professor and chair of history here at USD. Colin did his undergraduate work in history at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. He then went on to complete his PhD at the University of California, Irvine, and subsequently was a visiting professor at DePaul University and Middlebury College before joining the faculty here in September 2002. He has served as department chair since 2014, and he teaches a range of classes, including U.S. environmental history, the U.S. history of food, environmental visual culture, and history and memory. He has also taught the senior thesis sequence required of all history majors. Colin's research centers on minority cultures of nature in the United States, as well as urban environmental history. His book, Urban Green, Nature, Recreation, and the Working Class in Industrial Chicago, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2015, argues that it was not just affluent Anglo-Americans who sought out nature during their leisure time. Dr. Fisher documents how working-class white immigrants and African Americans in rapidly industrializing Chicago also fled the urban environment during their scarce leisure time. In so doing, marginalized Chicagoans used landscapes in nature's nation to forge subaltern German, Irish, Polish, African American, and working class identities. Dr. Fisher's book, writes one reviewer, provides a cautionary tale for the present as global warming, pollution, and other environmental challenges threaten the life of the planet. I think, Colin, maybe a second run on your book, given what we're experiencing right now in California in terms of global challenges. Colin will be speaking this afternoon on Martin Delaney, Yellow Fever Epidemics, and the Birth of Black Nationalism in Antebellum America.
First of all, I just want to say that this work is part of a larger project on Black climate science in Antebellum America. So this is sort of a twist on that project. It's an ongoing research project, so I welcome any of your thoughts, your comments, your insights. And I also have to say, it's really hard to compete with a come after an art historian in terms of PowerPoint slides, but I'll try to do try to do my best here. Thanks, Derrick. So historians have long noted that racial thinking is one important social side effect of outbreaks of epidemic disease. Joyce Chaplin, for instance, shows how extraordinarily high Native American mortality rates when Europeans arrived in the 17th century, 18th century in North America, rates as high as 90%, if you can believe that, sometimes in excess of 90%, prompted some English settlers to consider that there might be something categorically different and inferior about Native American bodies. They're seeing this incredible wipeout happening around them. And this gives rise to the sort of a nascent racial thinking. Perhaps skin color and differences in hair and things like that, external sort of differences in population groups. Maybe this is just the tip of the iceberg, and that the bodies of Native Americans and the bodies of Europeans are somehow fundamentally different. I mean, how else to explain the fact that you arrive and Native Americans are dying everywhere? Now, while smallpox epidemics in the 17th and 18th century amongst Native Americans opens up this question of racial difference, I'm going to argue that yellow fever epidemics of the late 18th and early 19th, the first half of the 19th century, really hardened American racial thinking. During the 1840s and 1850s, American and European scientific racists point to supposed Black immunity to yellow fever and other tropical diseases as evidence that Black and whites are not only different, but in fact, different species, right? That they're not even members of the same species. And this is, I mean, you might think this is an extraordinary thought, but this is the dominant science by the 1840s. Rejecting the story of the Garden of Eden, scientific racists argue that Blacks and whites are radically different products of different separate creations that occur in different parts of the world. Whites in temperate areas, Blacks in tropical Africa. And this is the theory of polygenesis, separate origins. Something that's highly controversial, especially amongst Christians who are looking back to the story of Genesis for their story of origins. As I'm going to show, Black people's supposed immunity to yellow fever and other tropical diseases gives rise not only to polygenetic scientific racism, it also plays a significant, even crucial role in the birth of Black nationalism, which emerges with Martin Delaney in the antebellum period during the 1850s. So, in order to tell my story, in order for this to make sense, we need to know some facts about yellow fever. Yellow fever is a mosquito-borne viral disease that originated in East or Central Africa. This is still inconclusive. Most scientists believe that it emerged out of primate populations and then spread amongst human populations. And the yellow fever virus on the left and its vector, this mosquito on the right, Aedes aegypti, was most likely transported to the Americas very early on with the birth of the slave trade. So it came from out of West Africa, and these mosquitoes propagated very effectively in the barrels of fresh water on slave ships. Aedes aegypti thrives in the ecosystems that humans create. I mean, it's almost a domesticated animal. It thrived before the slave trade. It thrived in the yam growing regions of West Africa. It thrived after the development of the plantation economy of the Caribbean and the American South. Anywhere where there's standing water, barrels of water, the mosquito does really well. It actually does very, very well in cities. It's a very much of an urban mosquito as well. And one thing to note, I think, from the perspective of a historian, is that there's been a lot of attention to the Columbian exchange. That is the exchange of plants, animals, and microorganisms between Europe and the Americas, but far less attention to the exchange of plants, animals, and microorganisms between Africa and the Americas. And this is very much an example of that exchange. So It's also important to recognize that scientists at the time have no understanding that yellow fever was caused by mosquitoes. They have much less a thing called a virus. They do know that yellow fever is found in, it's a tropical and subtropical disease. If it does emerge in a temperate area, it's only during summer. And many think that this is a disease that's caused by miasmas or winds off of swamps. White scientists also believe that Black people have an innate racial resistance to yellow fever, and white people are especially susceptible to yellow fever. So there's a kind of racial distinction that's drawn with this disease. White scientists, white intellectuals knew that yellow fever had decimated Napoleon's troops when they arrived in 1802 to crush the Haitian slave rebellion. 20,000 French troops go to Haiti, and only 3,000 return to France. I mean, that's a wipeout. And they also knew that, and they were so convinced that yellow fever was a disease that African people, Black people, had resistance to, that when there was a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793, which ended up killing about 9% of the population, African Americans are made as they're sort of the first responders. They're the essential workers, not unlike today, because there's this sense that they have this immunity. So they're going to be the nurses, the caretakers. So why would white Americans think that Black people are resistant to yellow fever? For one, there's the argument for Black immunity is a very convenient excuse for forcing Black people to do plantation labor in lowland areas, in swampy areas where yellow fever is endemic. But there's another reason, and this gets us into the sort of a little bit more science, and that is that whites confused childhood acquired immunity to yellow fever with innate racial immunity. So what do I mean by this? Unlike malaria, yellow fever is actually really benign. When children get it, it's a benign reaction. So it's like COVID. Like children with COVID, typically their course is much easier than older people. This is the same thing with yellow fever. When children got it, they almost always survived, and then they had resistance to yellow fever for the rest of their lives. And hopefully that's the case with COVID as well. Large numbers of enslaved Black people had been exposed to yellow fever as children, either in Africa or in the Caribbean or in the American South. European and Northern white adults in the United States who had never had exposure to yellow fever as children, when they got it as adults, the consequences were horrendous. This is a terrible disease that killed off 50% of the people who came down with a severe case of it. And you're going to get a severe case if you didn't get a case of it when you were a child. Yellow fever outcomes, though, had nothing to do with race and everything to do with history and geography. We can see this with Philadelphia, where Black Philadelphians who'd never contracted yellow fever as a child because they were Northern, they were in the North, that population that had not come from Africa, that had grew up in Philadelphia, had never gotten yellow fever as a child. They died off at the same rate as white folks in Philadelphia. Conversely, a white person who contracted yellow fever as a child, say in a sugar plantation in Louisiana or in New Orleans, that person's going to have a much more easy go of it as an adult. They have some resistance born of this childhood exposure. This confusion of childhood immunity with innate racial resistance buttresses the rapid growth of polygenetic scientific racism during the first half of the 19th century. And to support the claim that Black people were a different and inferior race of people, white scientists, they look at skulls, right? This is Samuel Morton, the great skull collector. But Louis Agassiz and Isaiah Knott and other polygenetic racial scientists also point to tropical fevers, the difference in outcome with tropical fevers, especially yellow fever. So in essence, what's going on here is antebellum white intellectuals are using flawed epidemiological data to support extraordinarily racist conclusions. Furthermore, they're using these outcomes to buttress the argument that different races belong in different climatic places. So according to race scientists, white people are a species that originate in temperate latitudes. Black people are a species of that originated in tropical latitudes, and that when a white person leaves the north and goes into the south, right, they're going to get yellow fever, they're going to get a tropical disease. This is why Africa is the white man's grave, right? The white people are sort of consigned to the north because of their race. At the same time, Black people are consigned to the south, and when they go north, they're going to get other types of diseases. I mean, it sounds very weird, but this is what they said: tuberculosis and insanity if you go farther north. So race is really disease is really understood as disease out of place, right? So there's a sort of geographic conception of race and of disease, and yellow fever really supports that view. Now, to get to my main point here, African Americans very much disagree with this assessment. Frederick Douglass over here, James McCune Smith over here, the first Black MD in the United States who was trained in Scotland, argued that the tropics were just as dangerous for whites and for Blacks, that the tropics are a grave for all people. And they also argue that Black people can survive in the North just as well as white people. And it's not for nothing that they call their newspaper, the most famous abolitionist newspaper of the 19th century, the North Star, right? That the North is a direction, the North is available to Black people, that they can go north and not get sick. So Douglass and Smith also challenge race scientists by arguing that there's only one type of humanity, right? They point to the story of the Garden of Eden. But even more, and this takes us a little bit off course here, but they argue, it's important, they argue that race is not a fixed category, that in fact, climate forms race, so that when a German goes to Liberia, that German, over time, he and his offspring will slowly become Black. And likewise, when a Black person goes to Germany, that person and his offspring will slowly become white. And Douglass and McCune Smith believe that the climate of North America is slowly transforming white and Black people into the bodies, racially, into Native Americans. They're going to become Aboriginal people with Aboriginal racial markings. And for this reason, this is partially one of the reasons why Frederick Douglass and James McCune Smith are optimistic in the face of slavery, that the United States is going to be able to work out its racial problems, and we're going to be able to create a nation where there's equality and slavery disappears, because the actual markers of race, because of climate, will slowly disappear, right? They're going to dissipate. So Martin Delaney, on the other hand, takes a very different point of view. Delaney argues that, and he agrees with Douglass, and he agrees with James McCune Smith up until 1850, and then something really, he has a sort of kind of a radical shift in his life. And this was born of two things. One, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is signed, which makes people in the North, like Delaney, like Douglass, like James McCune Smith, they're suddenly vulnerable to being sent back to the South. And the other thing is Delaney's a physician, and he applies to Harvard Medical School in 1850 and gets in. He's very excited. He's going to be, the second MD in the United States after his friend James McCune Smith. He shows up, and within a week, he's expelled for being Black, right? So he's shown the door from Harvard. You can't be a Black MD in the United States in 1850. And this discourages him. And he comes to the conclusion that America is so hopelessly racist that the only solution for Black people is basically to leave. that Black people need to leave the United States and form their own nation. And my point is that Delaney's understanding of yellow fever, his understanding of tropical disease, strongly shapes his Black nationalism. Delaney's a physician. Like many physicians, he doesn't have an MD, right? That's common in the antebellum period. He taught anatomy, and he knew full well that the idea that Black people, if they went north, that they would get sick was ludicrous. Delaney, in fact, was born in West Virginia. He actually liked going hiking in the mountains of Pennsylvania. He ultimately moves to Canada. He's so convinced that cold is not going to do anything bad to the bodies of Black people. At the same time, Delaney takes seriously the scientific consensus at the time that Black people have some sort of resistance to yellow fever, right? And that white people are susceptible to tropical diseases, and that Africa is indeed the white man's grave. And you can see this in this quote here. I'll just sort of leave it up for you to read, because I know I'm sort of running out of time here. But he notes this distinction, this racial distinction based on geography. Black people, in a nutshell, can live anywhere. White people can only live in northern areas, right? They cannot go south. So what Delaney does is he turns scientific racism upside down, and he uses epidemiological data in the scientific dominant culture to argue that it's not white people who are the dominant race, it's Black people who are the dominant race, right? This is evidence that Black people can survive anywhere, whereas enfeebled white people, they can't make it in the tropics. And in fact, he questions whether they can even make it in the Americas. And maybe really the only place that white people are healthy is back in Europe, right? That's the only area. So this understanding of tropical disease plays a crucial role in where Delaney decides to locate the first, sort of Black nation, this Pan-African Black nation. He first thinks about Canada. We could form a Black nation in Canada. Black people can handle the cold, not a problem. The problem is there's too many white people up there, right? So what he settles on ultimately is West Africa. I mean, he thinks about Latin America too, but ultimately West Africa. And a crucial reason for his choice of creating a Black refugee immigrant nation of African Americans in West Africa is that African diseases, tropical diseases like yellow fever, will serve as an impenetrable defensive fortification against white people, right? That yellow fever will maintain Africa as a white man's grave, right? And prevent white people from invading. So in other words, Delaney sees Africa as a climatic fortress, right? And this is before quinine and repeating rifles and all of that. So to test whether whether African-American pioneers can thrive in Africa, in the tropics, what Delaney does is he does whatever every good sort of 19th century scientist would do, and he forms an expedition, right? And this is his expedition of adventure to the Niger Valley. I'm sorry for all the text. This is the sort of contents because it's telling. So he forms a 1859, a Black expedition to West Africa with an all scientific Black team. Originally it was going to be a photographer, a landscape painter, natural historian, doctors, and so on, all Black, to go and assess whether West Africa was a healthy place for African-American pioneers. And his conclusion is that as long as you stay away from the mangrove swamps, stay on high ground, it's actually really great. And you can see this. He actually compares it to Champagne, the first site of the coast of Africa. He doesn't drink champagne, but this is what he thinks the experience of drinking champagne would do to him. He sees Africa, and it's an emotional, intellectual, sensual, full body experience. His body is charged just by the sight of Africa, right? And you can see the full quote there from 1861. And he goes on further to say that African Americans with chronic disorders, as long as they can handle the seasoning process, Africa, the landscape, the climate of Africa will cure them of all of their chronic disorders. So it's a healing place, right? So this call, Delaney's call to emigrate to Africa, breaks his friendship with Frederick Douglass. And Douglass argues Delaney is leaving everybody behind. He's jumping ship. And what about the slaves in the South? You should stay and fight for abolition, protect your people, all of that. But Delaney argues that by leaving the United States, that they could actually fight slavery in a way more effectively. So while Douglass is arguing for an internal political challenge to slavery, Delaney argues for an external economic and military challenge to slavery. And the idea is this: African Americans moved to West Africa. They set up a new nation in the Niger Valley. And what they're going to do is grow cotton. And they're going to grow cotton more effectively because Black people know, African Americans know how to grow cotton. And the land is actually more productive of cotton than the American South. And what they're going to do is undersell their cotton. They're going to sell it to English textile firms for a cheaper price than white plantation owners in the American South. And by doing that, they can basically drive the South into bankruptcy, right? So that's the economic side of it. The military side is that in Africa, because of tropical diseases, they have this highly defensible, climatic sort of fortress. They can use this as a base for forward operations, forward military operations in the Caribbean and also in the American South, basically sparking slave insurrections and ultimately driving white people out of the Caribbean and out of the American South and farther north. And in sort of anticipating the Black nationalism of Marcus Garvey, Delaney here is imagining working in tandem with tropical disease, using disease as a kind of tool for sort of a Black sort of Black nationalism, that they can essentially create this transatlantic Black nation that will tie Black people in Africa to Black people in the Americas, and essentially create their own nation. So good, yeah, so in conclusion, I realize I'm running out of time. Just like today, Americans have long used epidemic diseases to buttress and even generate racist, sexist, homophobic, and class-based views. White responses to yellow fever outbreaks are perhaps the clearest example of how infectious disease can be used as a springboard for some of the most extreme forms of racism that have ever been marshaled in the United States. Again and again, polygenetic scientific racists pointed to Black people's supposed resistance to yellow fever and other tropical fevers to support their view that Black people were somehow not only different, but a distinct species, a different species born of separate creation. At the same time, it's really important to note, especially I think today, that the privileged have no monopoly on using epidemics to make claims about power and social difference. In the 19th century, in the Antebellum period, we can very much see this with Martin Delaney. Delaney draws on conventional wisdom, draws on epidemiological data that white scientists are using. And from this premise, he argues that while Black people can survive in any climate, white people are confined to temperate latitudes. And if white people travel into the torrid zone, they're going to die of tropical diseases or have trouble reproducing and eventually die out as a race. This climatic insight about disease and race then serves as the foundation for Delaney's Black nationalism and his efforts to create a transatlantic Black nation that would connect Africa, the Caribbean, Central America, and the American South. Thank you very much.
Well, the floor is open for questions. And again, if you prefer to post them in chat, you can, or you can simply raise your hand either physically or a yellow hand like Florence just has. So yes, Florence, please go ahead.
Colin, so much of these ideas of sending or of Blacks choosing to go back to Africa just assume that people from this side of the Atlantic make the decision of who goes there. But there must be a whole history of what the Africans thought about this, of where did they go back to and what did they think? And are there people who study whatever happened to those people who did go back and what has happened to their descendants? It's like, you know, there must be another side of all these stories.
It's true that I think, you know, the nation state sometimes it has this effect on the way historians operate. And you can see it in textbooks and the way we arrange our classes. And we like to think of nations as sort of these kind of islands. And this is true too of African-American history, where we kind of look at the perspective of African-Americans and not so much the perspective of the Africans and how are they seeing these American Black nationalists who are eager to create a Black nation in their homeland, right? So it's an excellent question. As for those African-Americans who did migrate, there was a significant number of people who did emigrate to Liberia, starting really in the 1830s as part of the colonization movement. They suffered, one historian argues that it was the greatest sort of demographic disaster in terms of disease. Large numbers of people died. African Americans going to Liberia dying of tropical diseases. So there was just a tremendous death toll, which is part of why Frederick Douglass and James McCune Smith are so wary about Delaney's emigration plans. But Liberia today is very much a product of this history. And it's still divided between those of American descent and those people whose ancestors have always been in Liberia. There's very much a kind of divide in Liberian society. But there's good work on, later on, Black nationalists who go to Ghana and Tanzania. And there's also good work too on Africans. I know more about Marcus Garvey. I mean, there's definitely some historians have looked at Delaney and the treaty that he tried to sign in Liberia that was, and argued in a sense, I mean, African Americans could operate in a kind of colonial capacity in Africa. And I think this is especially true of Marcus Garvey during the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, he really has this idea. He calls himself president of Africa, right? There's a lot of Africans who aren't they're Garveyites. Garveyism just takes off in Africa, but it's mobilized and used for local nationalist struggles. So the ANC uses it. The Liberians themselves embrace a kind of version of Garveyism, but they like the idea of Black nationalism for creating their own Black African nations. They're not so keen on Marcus Garvey coming in and declaring himself president of Africa. Yeah. So you raise a really, really good question. And it's very important to pay attention to those. Just because you're marginalized, that doesn't mean that you get a free pass, right? And power operates in complicated ways. So absolutely. And Garvey wearing a pith helmet, on his expedition going into Africa. I mean, he's, in many ways, he has all the trappings of a kind of white explorer. Anyway, so it's a great question.
I was kind of fascinated by the idea of Saint Sebastian kind of morphing into a representation of the ability, I guess, through death or faith to transcend the ravaged plague body. And I'm wondering, first of all, how long, at least in your explorations, did he retain that sort of iconographic value? And also whether in looking at, and again, this may be something you haven't investigated very much, but in looking at more recent examples of art that are engaging with pandemic, if a similar sort of iconographic figure or way of representing our engagement with the disease, any kind of has emerged in anything that you come across?
So I'm not sure. He shows up late, at least in my quick survey of Renaissance imagery, as a kind of plague saint. He's not there at the very beginning, but then he has a big presence, especially in the Quattrocento and places like Florence and after. And I guess I was struck by his appearance in that text by Sontag being brought back as a kind of AIDS saint as well. And primarily for the reasons you said, that he has the ability to transcend the disease, that his body is never marked, and he survives, which is the part of the story that gets forgotten, I guess, by those. But it occurs to me that Turner's here, and he may have a better sense of Sebastian's life in medieval iconography than I do. I just don't know that piece well. Do you want to say something, Turner?
I don't know it well either, but I thought it was an excuse for Renaissance artists to paint a denuded male body. I didn't know that, so you've added layers to my own very simplistic understanding, because I didn't know that the beautiful and perfectly preserved body, in spite of being filled with arrows, but usually it's not dripping with blood, it's not deformed. I mean, he's oblivious in a kind of ecstatic trance almost, Yeah. And I didn't know that it was used as a symbol of plague resistance. I didn't know that, so I'm learning.
Yeah.
But
the examples, though, in medieval manuscripts, like he doesn't have a big place.
No, Sebastian isn't a big deal in the Middle Ages, is he? I think of it as a Renaissance thing, but it sounds like maybe it's as much a plague thing.
Yeah. I guess that's what I was hoping, and I'm really out of my depth here, but suggesting that might be why you see him so often in these 14th, 15th century representations, where he achieves that description that I think Turner gave much better than me, of this sort of perfect male form, able to withstand pain and suffering and still look great.
Exactly. What are a few hundred arrows, to a body like that?
Yeah.
I wish that Kate were here. She could illuminate us all on this.
But it seems that it's no accident that he is always given that attitude and that presentation. That seems to be something that artists agreed to, and that it fits this narrative. The second part of your question, Cynthia, I'm less sure I can answer now. I'm trying every day to track how artists are responding to the current pandemic, and they're doing it in a variety of ways. Some of it really do-it-yourself and interesting, as kind of taking to the streets activism, and then other more formal things. And I think it's too soon for me to say. The last image I showed was this wonderful series of masks that Ai Weiwei is producing. So Ai Weiwei is a politically engaged artist, known more for his protests in China, but here doing this global effort to make everybody wear masks that will express outrage.
Yeah, I was taken by that image, and I think part of it is I'm seeing increasingly just in pop-ups a lot of mask art, ranging from kind of kitschy stuff to very complicated masks covered with beads and sequins to, things made out of beautiful fabrics, and almost as if the mask itself becomes a sort of totem that says, I am transcending this, I'm not I incorporate myself into the mask and remain beautiful in the face of this disease.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're exactly right. I think I vaulted over it in my text to stay within the time, but in Venice, that's why masks are being worn. They become part of this carnival practice, but also to disguise disfigurement and to, become part of this series of social distancing measures that get implemented in 15th, 16th century Venice.
That's interesting. I didn't know that about that. And so now we're seeing a sort of renaissance of that use of the mask today. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that's where the iconic picture of the doctor with the big mask with the elongated beak.
Yeah.
This is where it comes from. I guess the thought was that with that long snout, you could stuff it with all kind of herbs and things, which would serve as a kind of filter to protect the doctor from whatever he might encounter in treating patients.
There's some.
I think that's how that snout became elongated. It served a medical purpose.
Yeah, it was filled with herbs, a kind of potpourri that was thought to filter the air and also filter out the the kind of awful smells of dealing with people who were sick with especially what I know about bubonic plague.
So interesting.
Yeah. I also have a question for you, Colin, and again, I don't know whether you've done any work in this area, but there's so much going on right now amongst right-wing groups and white supremacists in resurrecting old racial theories. And I wondered if, especially with the onset of this disease, whether there has been a revival in the idea of kind of climate or geographical based location that, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to say it, but it seems to me that it would be something that could easily be subjected to revival because it kind of goes back to the idea of knowing your place.
No, it's a really interesting question. The course of the climate theory of disease, which you're talking about the beak with the potpourri or spices or whatever to sort of filter out the air. I mean, that kind of that idea of malaria, bad air, miasmas. I mean, that continues well into the 19th century. And it's really only in the very end of the 19th century when you have the germ theory of disease, and that suddenly doctors you have this period in the 19th century where doctors are running around with barometers. They're running around trying to determine elevation and temperature. What are the wind patterns? All this kind of stuff. And all of that falls out the window with the germ theory of disease when it gets popularized in the late 19th century. Tropical medicine still continues, but it develops sort of on a different course. I think it's a really interesting question. The way in which COVID and race intersect, immediately what jumps to mind is, our president and, the Chinese flu and blaming China for this epidemic and by implication, there's a lot of people who, that's generative of a kind of widespread kind of racial reaction to people of Asian descent as potential carriers of it. And I've seen that firsthand. So, there's that kind of racism. But I think because of the understanding of viruses and the understanding of microorganisms, there's not this sense that disease is contained in a particular geographic area. Racists who are drawing racial lines when it comes to disease and blaming certain groups are not necessarily, it's not about the fact that there's a disease in a particular place. It's about the fact that there's a particular type of people who carry a disease in their bodies, and that all of our lines are porous wherever you're living. Mm-hmm. Just as a side note, it's really interesting, this whole idea that the Chinese should be blamed for COVID, when most historians, not 100% sure, but most historians think that the 1918 pandemic, the influenza pandemic, was generated out of Kansas, mm-hmm. which is far more deadly. That's 50 million people worldwide. If anybody needs to pay reparations for a disease, it's the people of Kansas. So.
Yes, I'm to blame then, because I'm from Kansas. So it was probably my ancestors who.
It could be, someone's pig farm, Yeah. So but I think just like Derrick is saying, that it's hard to determine at this point how COVID is going to be sort of a springboard for new representational forms. It's still unclear exactly how this is going to shape out in terms of our, racial thinking in the dominant culture.
Yeah, I think the degree to which I understand it, it's being used as part of a right-wing argument to close our borders more tightly and to keep those alien influences out of our country. And it's localized, because of this epidemic, I suppose, in this kind of anti-Asian fervor, but just supports this larger right-wing narrative of shutting down immigration in general.
Yeah, it's the rhetoric is sort of shifted from crime to disease that, potential cure. Of course, it's the United States that in deporting people here who have COVID back to Guatemala, it's our immigration policies that are playing a big role in spreading this. There's definitely some blowback as the result of our immigration policies. But yeah, you're absolutely right that the immigration rhetoric about closing borders and nationalism that pre-existed COVID, that COVID sort of reinforces some of that, for sure.
Yeah. Florence, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, did anybody see the headline today that COVID-19 has already peaked in Africa? I didn't read the article yet, but I can only imagine that analysis. Why Africa has apparently conquered it faster than we have.
Yeah.
So it's out. You can just only imagine what that's going to be.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, especially in light of the theorizing that Colin was bringing up about, certain kinds of diseases in Black populations being more naturally resistant to them and therefore superior.
Yeah.
Well, we are, I think, at the end of our time here. I want to thank once again Derrick and Colin for two really fascinating talks.